Good morning, Nigeria. Welcome to the newspaper review. I am Cassie Tony, and I'll be taking you through this segment. First, we'll start with the Hope newspaper, boldly written, Federal government raises alarm over the vision of official arms. On top of the newspaper, INEC warns against digital impersonation targeting commission. Still in the newspaper, fresh trouble for el-rufai. ICPC files 9-count charge. Still in the same newspaper, 12 years after, parents of adopted Chibok schoolgirls renew calls for rescue. At the bottom of the newspaper, NDLEA arrests 5, impounds trucks with 724 million naira cannabis in Edo. Moving away from that newspaper to the First Daily, boldly written, ADC lawmakers demand sack, prosecution of INEC chairman over alleged bias. On top of the newspaper, ICPC files fresh charges against Nasiri el-Rufai. PDP crisis deepens as Wike-backed NWC renovates secretariat. Bola Tinubu holds emergency security meeting with service chiefs. At the bottom of the newspaper, UTME 2026, JAM adjusts arrival time for candidates. Still in the same newspaper, NDLEA seizes 724.5 million naira cannabis, arrests 5 in Edo. Away from that to the Daily Trust, boldly written, against odds, ADC holds convention. You get it on page 3 and 4 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, tariff cuts on vehicles rise could weaken local production, coming from experts. Together on page 21 of the newspaper. Court to rule on el-rufai's bail application today. You get that on page 6 of the newspaper. Again, commander, soldiers killed in Boko Haram ambush. You get that on page 5 of the newspaper. Away from that to the New Telegraph, boldly written, Insecurity, terrorists killed Colonel, 6 soldiers during raid on military base in Borno. You get that on page 2, 3, 6, 25, 29, and 30 of the newspaper. On top of the newspaper, post recapitalization, 7 tiers 1 banks delivered 1.9 trillion naira returns to shareholders. Post recapitalization, 7 tier 1 banks deliver 1.9 trillion naira returns to shareholders. Together on page 3 of the newspaper. IMF, World Bank meetings, Ndume to drum support for Nigeria's reforms. Together on page 7 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, I didn't deny ADC use of Eagle Square, says Wike. You get that on page 2, 3, and 6 of the newspaper. Middle East crisis, Strait of Hormuz blockade against global interests, coming from China. You get that on page 4 of the newspaper. Away from that to the Daily Sun, boldly written, outrage over murder of Colonel, 6 soldiers in fresh terrorist raid. You get that on page 4 and 6 of the newspaper. On top of the newspaper, Wike said he never denied ADC others' use of Eagle Square. You get that on page 27 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, I'll soon decide on Abia urban context, says Reps Deputy Speaker Kalu. You get that on page 28 of the newspaper. IMF warns Nigeria, others against policy misstep. You get it on page 2 of the newspaper. Ndume cries out over escalating insecurity in Borno. You get it on page 5 of the newspaper. Away from that to the Daily Monitor, boldly written, insecurity can end in 6 months if federal government is serious, coming from Ndume. At the top of the newspaper, Peter Obi says 2027 North is Nigeria's greatest asset. I'll prioritize its development. Still in the same newspaper, federal government warns security personnel against the vision of official arm. You get that on page 4 of the newspaper. ADC holds national convention today amid crisis, together on page 2 of the newspaper. Commanding officer, 6 others killed in IED in Mongono, together on page 5 of the newspaper. At the bottom of the newspaper, Middle East crisis, Nigeria's economy in shock, coming from finance. Away from that to the matrix, boldly written, Jili Market airstrike, presidency blasts Atiku over comment, together on page 2 of the newspaper. On top of the newspaper, Dangote refinery exports 44,000 barrel per day petrol in March, positions Nigeria as net exporter. Dangote refinery exports 44,000 barrel per day petrol in March, positions Nigeria as net exporter. You get that on page 3 of the newspaper. ADC crisis. As Supreme Court rules today, faction suspends Atiku, Babachia Lawa. You get it on page 3 of the newspaper. Nigeria's crude oil output rose to 1.3 million barrel per day in March, says OPEC. You get that on page 3 of the newspaper. Moving away from that newspaper to the Daily Independent, boldly written, Telcom link slow 5G rollout to state, councils hurdles. You get that on page 29 of the newspaper. On top of the newspaper, Army confirmed death of Colonel, 6 soldiers in clash with terrorists. You get that on page 7 of the newspaper. Nigeria's external reserves to decline to $47 billion in 2026, coming from Fitch. You get it on page 29 of the newspaper. Still in the same newspaper, 11 feared dead as hellmen raid Benue communities. You get it on page 7 of the newspaper. Shetima advocates national framework to foster youth leadership. You get it on page 6 of the newspaper. New FX policy for oil coils to deepen liquidity. You get it on page 29 of the newspaper. Tinubu meets security chiefs over Jili Market airstrike. U.S. travel warning. You get that on page 7 of the newspaper. ADC reps demand sack, prosecution of INEC chairman. You get that on page 7 of the newspaper. Away from that newspaper to the leadership, boldly written, Tinubu doesn't want opposition to exist, coming from Peter Obi. You get that on page 6 of the newspaper. On top of the newspaper, northern leaders raise concern over rising attacks. You get that on page 4 of the newspaper. ICPC presses 9 fresh charges against el-rufai. You get that on page 6 of the newspaper. Wige clarifies Kubok bus terminal roof damage, says no structural collapse. You get that on page 20 of the newspaper. We've come to the end of this newspaper review. Many thanks for watching. I am Cassie Tony. Stay tuned as we bring you more updates across Nigeria. Do have a lovely day.